Imagine an America where George Washington never became the first president, no heroic general at the center to unite a fragile young nation. If that seat of power had fallen into the hands of someone else, with different ambitions, ideals, and flaws, would the United States still have risen as the world's leading superpower? Or would it have splintered and been swallowed by history? The unexpected decision, 1789. The year was 1789. The War for Independence had ended less than a decade earlier. And the United States of America was still an experiment, fragile, divided, and uncertain of its future. 13 states, once united against the tyranny of the British Crown, were now pulling in different directions. Each held its own ambitions, its own fears, and its own vision of what this young nation ought to be. The only thing they all agreed on was this: George Washington was supposed to be their first president. Washington was the obvious choice. The tall Virginian general had led the Continental Army through hardship, hunger, and near despair, and somehow against all odds, he had won. He was revered, not just as a commander, but as a man of honor who had refused to crown himself king when some urged him to seize power. He embodied the very spirit of the Republic: strength, humility, and virtue. But in this story, this strange branch of history, the man the people trusted most would never take the oath of office. The announcement, on a cold morning in March, just weeks before the new government was to convene in New York City. Washington called together a small group of confidants at Mount Vernon. His health had been failing, the winters had grown harder on his aging body, and the years of war had left scars deeper than any wound. With quiet but firm words, he declared his refusal. "I cannot," he said, his voice measured but heavy. "I have given my life to the service of this nation. I will not give it my death. Let younger men, with energy and vision, carry forth this experiment of liberty." His words fell like a stone into the hearts of those gathered. Alexander Hamilton was there, his sharp eyes glimmering with both disappointment and opportunity. Thomas Jefferson, recently returned from France, clenched his jaw, knowing this would tilt the balance of the Republic in dangerous directions. And James Madison scribbled furiously in his notebook, as if capturing the moment for history. News spread swiftly. Across taverns, markets, and state legislatures, Americans reacted with shock. The man they had trusted to hold the fragile Union together was stepping aside. In his absence, the nation would have to decide who would bear the mantle of leadership. The rise of Hamilton. It was Hamilton who seized the moment. Though young, barely in his 30s, he had already proven himself indispensable during the war. Serving as Washington's aide-de-camp, and later as the architect of much of the new nation's financial system. Brilliant, ambitious, and eloquent, Hamilton believed deeply in a strong central government that could unite the states into a powerful whole. His opponents saw something else: a man too enamored with power, too trusting of centralized authority, too close to monarchy in all but name. To many, he was brilliant, yes, but dangerously brilliant. Still, in the chaos that followed Washington's withdrawal, Hamilton emerged as the candidate of stability. The Federalists rallied behind him, arguing that only his vision could prevent the nation from splintering into 13 quarreling republics. Without Washington to balance the factions, Hamilton's rise felt almost inevitable. By April, the Electoral College cast their votes. John Adams, the stalwart patriot from Massachusetts, expected to be the consensus choice. But Hamilton's relentless campaigning and fiery speeches swayed enough electors to secure him the presidency. Adams, respected but less charismatic, was relegated to the vice presidency, a role he despised but could not refuse. On April 30, 1789, it was not George Washington who stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City with his hand on the Bible. It was Alexander Hamilton. His words rang out not with Washington's calm gravity, but with the fervor of a man convinced that destiny itself had chosen him. The atmosphere of doubt, yet not all celebrated. Farmers in Virginia muttered that the government would soon strangle them with taxes. Merchants in Boston worried that Hamilton's ambition would bind them to debts they did not want to carry. Even among his allies, there was unease. For all his genius, Hamilton lacked Washington's restraint. Where Washington commanded loyalty simply by standing in a room, Hamilton demanded it with force of will. Jefferson, in particular, bristled. He had returned from France filled with ideas of liberty and the rights of man. To him, Hamilton's vision was a betrayal, a path back toward monarchy under another name. Quietly, he began gathering allies, determined to resist what he feared would be the birth of an American tyrant. A different future dawns. The United States had been born with fragile bones, and Washington had been the glue expected to hold them together. Without him, the foundation of the new government rested on a man far more divisive, far less trusted, and infinitely more ambitious. In that moment, on the very day Hamilton placed his hand upon the Bible, the trajectory of America bent away from the course we know. The promise of unity gave way to the promise of power. And though the people cheered, though cannons fired in salute, though church bells rang across the city, an invisible crack had already begun to spread across the surface of the Republic. A crack that would, in time, split the nation in two. A different beginning. The year 1789 was supposed to mark the dawn of unity. Instead, it became the year of suspicion. With George Washington absent from the presidency, Alexander Hamilton's rise sent ripples of unease across the young republic. Some celebrated him as the savior of the Union. Others whispered that America had simply exchanged one crown for another. Only this time the crown was hidden beneath Republican clothing. The first acts. Hamilton wasted no time. In his inaugural address, he painted a picture of an America strong, prosperous, and respected among nations. He spoke of roads and canals binding the states together, of a financial system capable of funding not just the present but the generations to come. But behind the poetry lay policy. Within weeks, Hamilton introduced proposals to assume the state's Revolutionary War debts, to create a national bank, and to establish excise taxes that would provide steady income to the federal government. These measures, though visionary, struck many as overreach. Virginia planters grumbled that they were being forced to pay for the debts of Northern merchants. Western farmers cursed the whiskey tax that would soon bleed their already thin profits. To Hamilton, it was simple necessity. Order must be forged from chaos. But to his opponents, it was tyranny wearing the mask of efficiency. Adams in the shadows, Vice President John Adams found himself trapped in a role both powerless and humiliating. Overshadowed by Hamilton's charisma, Adams became little more than a ceremonial figure. He had expected to guide policy, to shape debates, to act as the steady hand Washington might have been. Instead, he watched as Hamilton swept aside dissent with sharp words and iron will. Adams grew bitter, muttering to friends that the presidency was becoming less a republic and more a stage for one man's ambition. His private letters, later preserved by historians, burned with resentment. "We are not governed by the people, but by the genius of one. And the genius of one is a dangerous thing." Jefferson's return. Thomas Jefferson had only recently returned from France, where he had witnessed the first sparks of revolution. He arrived in New York to find a nation he scarcely recognized. The Constitution he had hoped would protect the rights of the states seemed already under siege. To Jefferson, Hamilton's policies looked eerily like the centralized monarchies he had loathed in Europe. From the moment they met in Hamilton's new presidential office, the tension was palpable. Jefferson, soft-spoken but firm, warned, "Mr. President, you are binding free men to chains of debt. Is this the liberty for which we fought?" Hamilton, eyes flashing, replied, "No, Mr. Jefferson, it is the strength for which we fought. Without unity, without credit, this nation will collapse before it even stands." Their words were polite, but their meanings were daggers. The rift between them was not merely political, it was philosophical, moral, perhaps even spiritual. The seeds of division. Hamilton pressed forward. He centralized authority, expanded federal reach, and built institutions that bore his name even when he denied it. He dreamed of a mighty nation, equal to Britain, feared by France, and respected by all. But with every step he took, resistance grew. In Philadelphia taverns, men gathered to denounce the Hamiltonian monarchy. Farmers in western Pennsylvania plotted open defiance of the whiskey tax. Newspapers aligned with Jefferson printed scathing essays accusing the president of betraying the revolution. Hamilton answered criticism with brilliance but also with arrogance. His speeches dazzled, but his disdain for opposition was unmistakable. He did not simply debate his enemies, he sought to crush them. And so, slowly, lines were drawn. Federalists, loyal to Hamilton, saw him as the architect of America's greatness. Republicans, gathering around Jefferson, saw him as the architect of America's downfall. Whispers of rebellion. By 1791, the air itself seemed charged with conflict. In the southern states, legislatures debated whether Hamilton's assumption of debts was even constitutional. In the West, talk of secession, once unthinkable, crept into conversation. Farmers swore that if the federal collectors came for their whiskey, they would answer with rifles. Hamilton knew of the whispers, but he welcomed the confrontation. To him, order must be enforced. Rebellion was not to be tolerated. Let them resist, he told his cabinet one evening, pacing the room like a general before battle. This government must prove itself unbreakable, or it will not survive at all. Jefferson, standing in the corner, answered coldly, and in proving its strength, will it destroy the very freedom it claims to preserve? Their eyes locked, two visions of America colliding in silence. A nation on edge. By the end of Hamilton's first term, the promise of unity had already soured. The United States, barely born, stood on the edge of fracture. Where Washington's calm might have soothed, Hamilton's fire only sharpened the divide. The dream of liberty lived on, but so too did the fear that liberty itself was being reshaped into something unrecognizable. In the streets, people still cheered Hamilton's name, admiring the vigor with which he defended the Union. But in the countryside, in the quiet of night, another name was whispered: Jefferson. To some, he was the last defender of the Revolution's true spirit. To others, he was simply the man who would stop Hamilton before it was too late. The stage was set. America's first presidency was no age of harmony, but the opening act of a struggle that would decide whether the Republic lived as a beacon of freedom, or fell into the shadow of power. The early rift, 1795 to 1820. The young nation, barely a decade old, was already fraying at the edges. Alexander Hamilton's vision of a centralized, powerful government had taken root in the North, where merchants and bankers thrived under his policies. Cities like New York and Boston flourished with trade, credit, and industry, all fueled by the National Bank and Hamilton's fiscal reforms. But in the South, the story was very different. Plantation owners and farmers in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia felt increasingly alienated. Their economies depended on agriculture, and their wealth was measured in land and labor, not currency or stock. Hamilton's assumption of state debts, coupled with excise taxes on goods like whiskey, felt like a direct attack on their independence. Farmers whispered that the federal government cared only for northern merchants, for cities, for the ambitions of men like Hamilton. The seeds of resentment took root. The Whiskey Rebellion and the Southern response. In western Pennsylvania, the whiskey tax became the spark that ignited open defiance. Farmers armed themselves, refusing to pay what they called an unjust levy. Hamilton, now fully confident in his authority, dispatched federal troops to quell the unrest. For the first time, rifles clashed with the flag of the new republic. The rebellion was crushed, but the damage was done. To many in the South, Hamilton had revealed the true nature of his vision. Obedience was mandatory, freedom conditional. Jefferson capitalized on this sentiment, traveling the states to rally support for what he called the preservation of liberty. The contrast between Hamilton's strength and Jefferson's ideals drew clear lines. The division deepens. By the early 1800s, the ideological divide had hardened into geography. The North, dominated by Hamilton's Federalists, pursued commerce, banking, and infrastructure. Cities grew, roads and canals connected ports, and industrial development accelerated. Hamilton's dream of a strong, centralized America seemed on track. Meanwhile, the South felt increasingly marginalized. Jefferson's followers, calling themselves Republicans, emphasized states' rights, agricultural independence, and local governance. Southern legislatures debated whether secession might be necessary if the federal government continued to impose policies favoring the North. Tensions simmered for decades. Unlike the actual timeline of American history, there was no universally respected figure like Washington to mediate. Hamilton's charisma inspired loyalty, but it also inspired fear and opposition. Each policy he enacted, each law he enforced, widened the invisible chasm running down the spine of the nation. Early industrial versus agrarian conflict. Hamilton's policies encouraged rapid industrialization. Northern ports thrived, factories multiplied, and the national bank became the lifeblood of commerce. But the South, dependent on cash crops and enslaved labor, saw its influence in national affairs diminish. Congress became a battleground, with Northern representatives controlling legislation, taxation, and budgets. Jefferson's party warned that the imbalance could not last. In private letters, Jefferson wrote of a slow strangulation of Southern autonomy. He predicted that if Hamilton's vision continued unchecked, one day the South would rise in defense of its way of life. The cultural rift. It was not just politics, culture itself began to split along north-south lines. In the North, cities became centers of learning, art, and commerce. Social mobility was possible, even celebrated. In the South, the old plantation society clung to its hierarchies and traditions, viewing Northern influence with suspicion and even contempt. Families debated where loyalties lay. Farmers in Georgia feared Northern bankers more than they feared foreign powers. Merchants in New York worried that Southern resistance might fracture trade routes or even inspire rebellion. Newspapers inflamed passions on both sides, framing every disagreement as existential: liberty versus tyranny, freedom versus control, whispers of secession. By 1820, the whispers had grown louder. Southern leaders openly speculated about breaking away from a government they no longer trusted. They spoke of forming a confederacy if Hamilton's successors continued the policies of centralization and economic favoritism. Jefferson, now older but no less passionate, became a symbolic figurehead for this growing movement, rallying those who feared Hamilton's America had become an empire disguised as a republic. In the North, Hamilton's vision seemed unstoppable. Banks, ports, and factories flourished. The people of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York believed they were witnessing the birth of a mighty nation, one capable of challenging Britain or France on equal footing. But the South saw only oppression, a slow erosion of their liberties and traditions. The calm before the storm. As the 1820s dawned, America was a nation of two halves, economically intertwined yet ideologically divided, culturally connected yet socially estranged. The absence of Washington's unifying presence meant that dialogue, compromise, and moderation had no natural champion. Hamilton's successors would inherit both the power and the tension, setting the stage for the first civil conflict decades before it would have naturally occurred. The United States, once envisioned as a single, united republic, now stood on the brink of fracture. And while the world marveled at its progress in the North, few understood the storm silently brewing in the South, the storm that would, one day, test whether the American experiment could survive without the guiding hand of its first hero. The first flames of Civil War, 1821 to 1835. By the early 1820s, the cracks in the United States had become deep chasms. Alexander Hamilton's vision of a strong centralized government had brought the North prosperity and power. Yet in the South, it had sown seeds of anger, fear, and resentment. Farmers, planters, and local leaders whispered openly of secession, while Jefferson's followers rallied support for resistance. The tipping point came over taxation and trade. The federal government, under Hamilton's successors, passed aggressive tariffs favoring Northern industry. Southern states protested, claiming these laws were unconstitutional and economically ruinous. Efforts at negotiation failed. Letters, speeches, and petitions went unanswered, or were met with threats of federal enforcement. Hamilton's philosophy of unity through authority had left no room for compromise. The spark, in 1821, a minor conflict in South Carolina ignited tensions. Federal tax collectors attempting to seize goods from a southern port were met with armed resistance. Skirmishes erupted, quickly spreading to neighboring states. Farmers, previously hesitant, armed themselves, inspired by Jefferson's warnings of Northern overreach. Hamilton's government responded with force. Troops marched into the South, not as diplomats or peacekeepers, but as enforcers of federal will. The sight of Northern uniforms on Southern soil shattered any illusions of voluntary unity. In towns from Charleston to Savannah, banners of defiance went up, reading simply, "Freedom or Secession." Jefferson's shadow, Thomas Jefferson, now in his 70s, emerged as the symbolic leader of Southern resistance. Though too old to fight directly, his words carried weight. He traveled the countryside, speaking in town halls, writing manifestos, and reminding people of the Revolution's principles. Liberty, he proclaimed, was not given to be weighed against profit or industry. When the government favors some at the expense of others, it becomes tyranny disguised as order. Our allegiance is to freedom, not to Hamilton's ambition. His speeches fanned the flames of rebellion. Southern militias began to organize formally, electing officers and stockpiling weapons. By 1823, the stage was set. The United States, barely 30 years old, was on the brink of civil war. Northern resolve. In the North, cities thrived, factories produced wealth, banks controlled credit, and commerce flourished along canals and railroads. Hamilton's successors, men such as John Quincy Adams and Nathaniel Hamilton, were determined to preserve the Union by force if necessary. They argued that yielding to Southern threats would destroy the Republic before it truly began. Letters to governors urged swift action, and federal troops were moved closer to the Mason-Dixon line. In Northern newspapers, rebels were painted as traitors, enemies of progress, and saboteurs of the American dream. The stage was set for a war unlike any America had yet seen, a conflict not over foreign dominion, but over the very soul of the nation. The first battles. In 1825, the first organized clash occurred near Charleston, South Carolina. A Southern militia, numbering only a few thousand, faced a federal regiment twice its size. The fighting was brutal but limited, a prelude to the horrors to come. News of the skirmish spread like wildfire. In northern cities, citizens demanded that the rebellion be crushed. In the South, the battle became a rallying cry, a symbol that their freedom was worth blood and sacrifice. Over the next decade, small battles and insurgent actions flared across the southern states. Ports were blockaded, railroads sabotaged, and towns fortified, unlike the historical Civil War, which erupted in the 1860s. This conflict occurred while the Industrial Revolution was still in its infancy in America, giving the North logistical advantages but limiting the scope of destructive technology. Divided loyalties. The war also divided families, communities, and even states. Some northern-born residents living in the South remained loyal to Hamilton's vision, while southern-born residents in northern cities felt kinship with their homelands. Espionage, sabotage, and secret communication became the norm. Communities that once celebrated unity now viewed each other with suspicion. Neighbors spied on neighbors, and the very notion of American identity became contested. Despite the chaos, both sides shared a strange respect for Jefferson's presence. Though not a general, his philosophy guided the rebels. His warnings of centralized tyranny were quoted in letters, speeches, and proclamations. The conflict was no longer just a war over taxes or tariffs. It had become a war of ideals. A test of what America would be: a unified nation under a powerful central authority, or a collection of sovereign states defending their autonomy. The nation at a crossroads. By 1835, the war was in full swing. The South had established provisional governments in several states, claiming independence from a northern-dominated union. The North, industrially stronger, launched campaigns to reclaim ports and quell resistance. But the vast countryside, fortified towns, and southern militias made victory difficult. In homes, farms, and cities across the country, ordinary Americans were forced to choose sides. The conflict was no longer abstract, it was personal. And while Hamilton's successors believed they were saving the Union, Jefferson's followers were convinced they were preserving freedom itself. The United States, once envisioned as a shining beacon of liberty and unity, had fractured far earlier than in our timeline. And as the fires of war spread, the question loomed larger than ever. Could this young nation survive without the unifying figure who had been denied the presidency all those decades ago? A World Without a United America, 1835 to 1870. By the mid-1830s, the early Civil War had entrenched itself across the divided United States. The North, industrial and centralized, controlled major ports and most of the federal treasury, while the South, agricultural and fiercely independent, held vast stretches of farmland and interior towns. The conflict had evolved beyond mere taxation disputes. It had become a war over identity, ideology, and survival. Foreign eyes on a fractured nation. Across the Atlantic, European powers watched with keen interest. Britain, still wary of losing its former colonies, quietly supplied southern rebels with arms and advisors. France, recovering from internal turmoil, favored a strong northern government to maintain trade ties and counter British influence. Spain, though weakened, encouraged southern independence movements in the Americas, seeing an opportunity to regain influence in the Caribbean. Hamilton's northern government attempted to secure alliances and trade, but Europe's skepticism was palpable. A divided America was no longer a rising superpower, it was a patchwork of contested states. A playground for European interests. Diplomats in London and Paris discussed openly which side might be worth backing, treating the conflict less as an American Civil War than as a geopolitical chess game. The human cost. The war devastated both sides. Cities like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans became fortified battlegrounds. Railroads and roads were destroyed to slow the enemy's advance. In northern industrial towns, families faced shortages of goods as southern insurgents sabotaged supply lines. Casualties mounted, and the civilian population suffered as never before in American history. Yet, unlike in later wars, there was no heroic, unifying figure like Washington to inspire hope. Leadership on both sides was competent but flawed, often prioritizing ideology over humanity. The American experiment, once praised worldwide, now seemed fragile, unstable, and violent. The prolonged struggle, the conflict stretched over decades. Hamilton's vision of a centralized, industrial America clashed continuously with Jefferson's vision of local autonomy and agrarian independence. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Cities prospered under Northern control, but Southern towns remained defiant, fiercely protecting their way of life. The war also delayed technological and economic progress. Without a united national infrastructure, innovation spread slowly. Railroads were localized, factories lacked a national market, and trade remained fragmented. America, once poised to challenge European powers, was forced to focus inward, surviving rather than expanding. Global consequences. Internationally, the consequences were profound. Britain maintained its influence over Canada and the Caribbean, seeing a divided United States as incapable of asserting hemispheric dominance. France attempted to cultivate relationships with northern industrialists, but the southern insurgency limited their reach. Spain, Mexico, and other colonial powers exploited the chaos, reclaiming influence over trade routes and territories that might otherwise have fallen under American control. Without a unified America to act as a counterbalance, European conflicts lasted longer. The Napoleonic shadow lingered in new ways, and by the mid-19th century, the balance of power was more European-centric. The Americas, meanwhile, were a patchwork of struggling republics and semi-independent regions. The cultural divide deepens. The early Civil War also shaped the culture of the two Americas. The North celebrated industry, science, and commerce. Cities became hubs of innovation and intellectual exchange, yet also hotbeds of surveillance. As government agents monitored suspected Southern sympathizers, art and literature often glorified the industrial elite and Hamiltonian ideals of order. In the South, culture centered on tradition, independence, and resistance. Oral histories, pamphlets, and local newspapers chronicled tales of defiance against Northern authority. Jefferson's legacy was enshrined as the philosophical foundation for freedom, even as the practical reality of war imposed hardship on every household. By the 1860s, Americans no longer identified primarily as a single people. They were Northerners or Southerners, defined by ideology, economy, and geography. The word "united" in the nation's name had become almost ironic, a memory of what might have been. The lingering question, as the war dragged on into the late 1860s, observers both domestic and foreign asked the same question: could the United States ever reunite? Without George Washington to provide the moral and symbolic glue for unity, the Republic seemed destined to remain a divided continent. Diplomats, historians, and ordinary citizens alike pondered the cost of one decision: Washington's refusal to take office. A single man's choice had redirected history, plunging a young nation into decades of conflict and altering the balance of power across the globe. And yet, amid the destruction, there remained a glimmer of possibility. Both sides cherished the ideals of liberty and self-determination. Even if their visions differed, the war had made Americans wary, battle-hardened, and deeply conscious of their fragility, but it had not extinguished the hope that one day some new leader might finally bring them together. The World Without Washington, 1870 present. By 1870, half a century had passed since the young United States had fractured. The early Civil War, ignited by the absence of George Washington at the presidency, had left deep scars. The nation existed, yes, but as two separate entities rather than one. The Northern states, dominated by Hamilton's heirs and followers, had become an industrial powerhouse in its own right. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia flourished with factories, railroads, and a growing financial sector. The economy was strong, and trade with Europe flourished. Yet, this prosperity came at a cost: social unrest, a rigid hierarchy, and a population divided by ideology. Northerners viewed Southern separatists with suspicion, distrust, and sometimes outright hatred. The Southern states, bound by Jeffersonian ideals of agrarian independence, had developed a society deeply rooted in tradition. Large plantations and small farms alike resisted centralized authority. Southern leaders cultivated a culture of self-reliance, valuing freedom above economic efficiency. Their isolation slowed industrial development, but it also preserved a way of life increasingly alien to the North. Southern literature, music, and oral histories celebrated defiance and resilience, keeping Jefferson's warnings alive as a moral compass for generations. A divided continent, without a united America, the continent of North America became a patchwork of rival powers. Canada, still under British influence, maintained strong trade relationships with both northern and southern states, often playing them against each other. Mexico, having survived territorial losses in earlier decades, exerted influence in the South, further complicating the political landscape. The western frontier, never fully unified, became a region of semi-independent territories, frequently disputed and often lawless. In the absence of a single American voice, European powers continued to shape the global balance. Britain maintained naval dominance in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. France sought influence over northern commerce. And Spain, though diminished, retained pockets of authority in the Americas. Asia, Africa, and the Pacific saw diminished American involvement, leaving colonization and trade largely to European empires. The cultural legacy. Americans in both North and South grew up in very different worlds. In the North, children learned the story of Hamilton, a visionary who preserved the Union at great cost. Northern cities celebrated industry, science, and commerce as the highest forms of progress. In the South, students studied Jefferson as the defender of freedom, a man whose ideas had prevented the federal government from crushing local liberties. Over generations, the cultural divide deepened. Northerners and Southerners could travel freely within their regions but remained wary across borders. Marriages across North-South lines were rare. Trade often complicated by tariffs and restrictions. And newspapers fueled ongoing debates about loyalty, liberty, and the true vision of America. The global stage. Without a unified United States, the 20th century looked very different. Europe dominated the world stage well into the 20th century. Without American intervention in two world wars, global conflicts lasted longer and took heavier tolls. Britain, France, Germany, and Russia dictated the terms of diplomacy and expansion. The industrial North remained prosperous, but its influence was regional rather than global. The agrarian South preserved autonomy, but its isolation left it vulnerable to foreign pressures. The American century never occurred. There were no mass migrations shaping culture across continents. No Silicon Valley tech revolution reaching global markets. And no single American military force projecting power worldwide. The dream of a united, leading America was replaced by two separate experiments in governance, each flawed and incomplete in its own way. The legacy of a choice. Historians of the 21st century would look back on this alternate timeline and mark one moment as pivotal: George Washington's decision to refuse the presidency. His absence created a vacuum that Hamilton filled, but Hamilton's vision, while powerful, could not reconcile the ideological differences that had simmered since independence. In classrooms, books, and museums across both North and South, Washington was remembered as the man who might have united a continent. His refusal became legend, a cautionary tale about leadership, choice, and the fragile threads upon which history depends. The question lingered endlessly. What if the world had a Washington at its helm when the nation was born? Would there have been unity, peace, and a superpower to shape global destiny? Or would history have found another way to test humanity's resolve? A nation forever divided. By the modern era, the North and South had established formal borders, independent governments, and separate identities. Trade continued, sometimes cooperatively, sometimes in tension. Technology progressed differently in each region. Industry advanced faster in the North. Agriculture remained dominant in the South. Global politics moved on, largely indifferent to the quarrels of a divided America. Yet, on quiet evenings in both northern and southern towns, people still spoke of George Washington, not as president, not as leader, but as a man whose absence had reshaped an entire continent. His refusal to lead had changed the course of a nation and the world itself. The United States, as it existed in this timeline, was a reminder of the power of choice, the fragility of unity, and the profound impact of a single individual on history. And somewhere, in the imagination of historians and dreamers alike, the question remained: what might have been if George Washington had said yes? History is shaped by choices, and sometimes, the decision of a single person can change the fate of an entire nation. George Washington's refusal to take the presidency created a world very different from the one we know, a nation divided, a dream deferred, and a global order altered forever. But what do you think? Could a single leader truly change the course of history? Or is it the people, the ideas, and the times that decide? Share your thoughts and imagine with us. What would America, and the world, look like if history had taken a different path?